Hi, everybody. My name's Brian Koscak. I'm the token Canadian that was invited. The only city in North America that doesn't have a hockey team in the playoffs. Sydney knew I was going to say something about hockey. But before I get going here, I just wanted to do a shout out to Sydney. And I think this probably speaks to many people here. I've kind of I know Doug when this first started. I think I met him at some hotel talking about crowdfunding that I dragged my partner to come attend from Canada and saying, we got to go check this out. This thing's the latest thing. And I think I saw Candace speak on a panel. Maybe even Joy was there. My memory's dating me. But it's like, oh, we've been in this a long time. It's like only a few years, but you feel it's been, a long time. But in my former life, I was involved in the insurance brokerage business, and I was involved in creating the snowbirds, which are Canadian snowbirds that come down south. And they formed a group and association, was very much involved in developing that whole ecosystem, seeing how they come together through magazines, media, et cetera, and form a cohesive affinity group. And I've seen, this whole industry, especially down south, give birth. And you have to have a medium that kind of sticks in it and glues it all together. And I think, for my vantage point, some of the best content is on Crowdfunding Beat. I know, Cindy, you've done a lot of work to create that medium for all of us here today to give us position, profile, information, education, et cetera. And that's very important. I know I may not be able to go to all the conferences for various reasons, but going to that rich video library, there's really good stuff on there that if you can't travel or you miss it, and half the time I'm sitting there, I can't keep up with all the stuff he's posting, whether it's video or otherwise, and the fact that he has different countries, you can kind of see that this is a global phenomenon. And that's also why I'm here today to talk about what's happening in Canada. But I just thought, Sydney, thank you very much for all your hard work and for organizing this today. Yeah. So my name is Brian Koscak. I'm a lawyer, a partner at Cassels Brock Blackwell in Toronto. I am also the vice chair. I used to be the chair for 4.5 years of the, it used to be called the Exempt Market Dealers Association of Canada. Now it's called the Private Capital Markets Association of Canada. And exempt, you say, why'd you call it exempt? Because it was exempt from a prospectus. And the perception up there for a lot of times was, oh, it's exempt, that means there's no rules, there's no disclosure, it's the Wild West. And so slowly we started evolving that. No, this is really private public markets. But I'm going back to 2012 in my involvement when the Jobs Act was passed, and I was getting all these calls about, you got to get into this microfinance, et cetera, and this is the next thing. And I deal with a lot of dealers that deal with various size, larger type of deals. And my first idea was, what do I care about this area of financing? It's startups. You hear about fraud financing, microfinance, or otherwise. And didn't really understand it. But what I was chasing at the time was selling securities on the internet. That was exciting to me. And how dealers were going to do it up where I live. And how do you syndicate them? And as this evolved in the summer, I was asked by the Ontario Securities Commission to be a member of their Exempt Market Advisory Committee, which they're trying to figure out new ways to raise capital. And there's one exemption that makes it pretty well easy to raise capital. There's a cost of capital in Canada called the OM exemption, which they don't have in Ontario. And a lot of the dealers and our members wanted that OM exemption to come to Ontario. So I was proud to be appointed. I was ready to go to bear. We had our first meeting, and there was the chair there, the vice chair, tons of staff. Room was full. And what do we talk about? Crowdfunding. So I'm sitting there going, I don't understand this. What is this? And I'm listening to the OSC's analysis and how they want to look at this new way of raising capital. And slowly it clicked in. This was selling securities on the internet. And then I got obviously very passionate and excited about it, started reading everything that was published here. And that's how kind of I got going into this. But I also say that by way of background, so you have an understanding of what others are looking at here and what's happening in America and how you're setting the bar through, which is a lot of intellectual rigor on how to raise capital in a fair and efficient manner, while also protecting investors. And these themes are, whether they're here, whether they're Australia, who's released a really interesting report, or they're in the UK, it's happening globally. So the experience up in Canada with crowdfunding, I thought I would leave this, I would talk to you in two parts. One is kind of what's going on in crowdfunding, and then what are messages for you in America if you want to do some cross-border deals and opportunities, and some landmines along the way you have to avoid. What's happening in Canada is, unfortunately, we don't have a national securities regulator. They're working on it. We have 10 provinces, 3 territories, and they try to all work together to try to do what are called nationalized and harmonized rules. So nationalized are the right across the country, like no one's opted out, and harmonized they're the same. Don't always get there because each one has a voice in how they want to do this. So if we look at crowdfunding, which is the equivalent of Title III here, we have only 6 jurisdictions that are looking at it. So for example, BC is looking at crowdfunding and saying they don't believe in this model at all because they believe that with an exempt market dealer, which is like a FINRA light type of dealer we have in Canada that just can raise capital in the exempt markets, that with what they call an offering memorandum exemption that can be sold to the public, you put that online, BC will say, we've been crowdfunding here for 7, 8 years. So what's happening is Ontario, Quebec, and 4 other jurisdictions have set out a proposal, and like all things, they're looking to mix and match of what is best for the ecosystem in those jurisdictions, and they've taken some stuff from the US model, some stuff they have not. I think the whole percentage of income and assets they just stayed away from, so it's just a flat $2,500 per investment up to 10 grand any 12 months. But you know, that's a more restrictive measure and model. However, they're looking for issuers they can raise up to 1.5 million, so that's better than $1 million. So where are we at with that? Well, they released a number of, a model, a framework. They had a concept paper, and then they had a framework in 2014 that's come out, and we're not there yet. But I think it's like I will kind of speculate. I'll be wrong, as others up here have done today. But my feeling is that with all the comment letters that have come in, they're pretty close. And hopefully in the next few months, we'll see something, which hopefully is the final form. Because at the end of the day, I think they've been dealing with certain aspects of it that generate a lot of comment letters. There's over 800. Some of them were, believe it or not, they wanted to ban real estate. So they just worried that in certain offerings out west especially, there was a lot of fraud in using actually the OM exemption, raising capital, and they thought real estate maybe doesn't work, but actually it does. And I actually have been involved in setting up one in Ontario that's actually a dealer that's going to be involved in real estate crowdfunding. So the good news is that we're almost there yet, and I'm kind of sitting here saying if we do, or you know, these jurisdictions do come out and actually beat Title III, I found that quite interesting and ironic. But they're still struggling with the same concepts that are, you know, you're struggling with here. You know, how do you regulate or under or over regulate the intermediary, like this FINRA light type of dealer? Actually, in Canada, we have that exempt market dealer. This would be a restricted dealer. So in my world, it would be like an exempt market dealer light, which has even less requirements to raise capital. So that's a proposal out there that hopefully that they can close the loop on. Been looking at this for a couple years. However, I can tell you right now, for a specific crowdfunding exemption, crowdfunding is legal in Canada. One province called Saskatchewan. And Saskatchewan has a startup crowdfunding exemption. And it is, to say the least, controversial. In terms of a proposal, Saskatchewan has put their proposal on the block, as well as 4 other provinces are now looking at a whole startup exemption based on that model. And it is only allowing issuers to raise up to $300,000 in a 12-month period, and investors can only put no more than $1,500. The kicker is, to many, which they are finding contentious, is the portal is not regulated. You have to submit some forms and background checks on the principals, but it's not regulated. So from the startup community, they love it, they're embracing it, etc. But last I heard, there is not one portal yet in Saskatchewan that's gone live. I think it's been stuck in the regulatory framework or processes. I think also because they're looking at the greater framework and the comment letters that they're not ready to release any until they finalize that, and hopefully that will be soon as well. But to go back to, so these are 2 proposals that are out there. They're not finalized yet, but they're pending. So if you ask me, can you crowdfund in Canada today, I'd say yes. And you probably say, well, you just said that there are proposals out there. How can you say that? And I'm going to go back to definitions. And I think some of the speakers today were talking about, like, what is crowdfunding? And at the end of the day, you look at the word crowd and selling to credit investors. Is that really the crowd? In Canada, less than 4% of the population are credit investors. So you can get into those definitions, but I really call it selling securities on the internet to the public is crowdfunding. And you can do that today with an exempt market dealer, and they can sell under existing prospectus exemptions. They can sell to accredited investors. That's one exception, just as you have here, and you're going through your review of definitions, et cetera, which I've said earlier we have done, and there's no indexing or otherwise. They're leaving it as is. They've changed a few parts of the definition to expanding it a bit more, as well as they have now a risk warning form that investors now have to initial like many times that you can lose all your money, et cetera. That has been the result of all the review of the credit investor exemption, which has actually, these ones have just been implemented May 5th. So when we look at selling securities on the internet and going back to BC, that's how they view that an exempt market dealer selling securities under existing exemptions can crowdfund today. So I've set up a number of portals or exempt market dealers who are doing that today. I'm not here to say there's 50 or 100. There's probably a handful. It's still a nascent industry there. A lot of exempt market dealers are trying to understand how they can move to an online platform, because part of the concern here is they are dealers. Someone said earlier, and they're bang on, that securities, they're not bought, they're sold. And you develop relationships, and with these types of exempt market dealers, you have to do suitability analysis. You have to ask a lot of questions. So where this is at is, how do you get a platform that does not disintermediate, but works with that broker-dealer community to help increase sales? I think that's where we're at. So you're seeing a few portals out there that are doing institutional crowdfunding. Everyone's using different words, or crowd investor crowdfunding, and they're trying to access that niche. It's still early days. So a lot of the regulators are looking at dealers, and as soon as you say you want to do it online, the brakes go on, and it's going to be a long process. We talked earlier about what does the application look like. Do you come in with a software all done, or do you come in with a wireframe and an idea? My whole recommendation always is, you can come in with a wireframe, but they'll approve you, and they'll put terms and conditions that they want to see the software. Why wouldn't they? To make sure that if you have all the bells and whistles that you need to make sure that you comply with the exemptions. So that's how I look at that. Exempt market dealers are starting, being part of this association. This was the Exempt Market Dealers Association. This was separate from crowdfunding. There were two worlds, because the dealers looked at crowdfunding as something separate and apart, and there's not enough money and was small. But if you look at the ecosystem of capital raising, it has a place. And if you don't want to do it in terms of an issuer or a dealer, then don't. Then maybe you're going to this size marketplace. And just as I'm hearing today, there's different niche portals. It could be real estate, it could be a generalist, it could be someone who's strapping on loans or tax incentives and all these other things. This is how this model will evolve. So that's kind of like the quick update on what's going on with the capital raising exemptions in Canada. There's other ones, like in Ontario, that were not there. So many times they're talking about the capital raising crisis in Ontario, or even across Canada. My view has always been, as a securities lawyer, it's really the prospectus exemption gap. There were not enough exemptions. In Ontario, till recently, you went from a private issuer to an accredited investor. That's a big gap, and there's not enough other exemptions out there. But they've recently passed a family and friends and close business associates exemption, and other ones are coming down the pipe. I won't bore you with them, but it's going to make it a more graduated field where there are different exemptions that are available. So I talked a little bit earlier with your Reg A panel that we're pretty excited. I know I'm pretty excited about Reg A plus. I always have to qualify that. It says not Reg A plus, it's Regulation plus, because people up there sort of ask me, what do you mean Reg A plus? And the fact that Canadian companies can be part of it, I think there are huge opportunities for companies going northbound or southbound, as well as for investors. We'd love to invest in some really good American companies, especially with the difference in the dollar. I can't emphasize that enough. That is very real. God knows I felt that when I got my Canadian dollar exchange to U.S. dollars coming here just to pay for a taxi. So those are opportunities. There's some things that have to be worked out. The regulators are looking at it. Out west, they might be looking at a blanket order of some sort to see how they can do this. And like all things, it'll take time with the first example to work out the kinks. The one caveat that I'll remind you of is that U.S. companies trying to raise capital that end up being on OTC, and you can end up being on OTC not voluntarily, but just you're there. It could deem you a reporting issuer or a public company in Canada, and you may not want that. That's a concern. That's not in Ontario. So there's little things like that. The fact that they're free trading, you'd have to sell them in Canada that they would not be free trading. So some of those things that have to be worked out, but there are big opportunities. There's a big investor base. There's definitely an appetite. So I just wanted to remind you also to look north, because we'll be looking south. Have you heard that before? So now I'll leave you with, in terms of the larger ecosystem, in terms of cross-border opportunities. So in my involvement in this, I'm at a larger law firm, and people are associating crowdfunding, even my own partners, as the smaller end of capital raising, that there are opportunities to put together U.S. broker-dealers and exempt market dealers. So the idea up north, if a U.S. company is trying to raise capital in Canada, why are they here? Why can't you raise capital in the world's largest capital markets? So there's always some sort of stigma associated with that, rightly or wrongly. But the idea, if you see where my vision, what I want to share with you is where I see this going is, if you have a relationship with a U.S. broker-dealer, with an exempt market dealer, whether it's Reg A plus or credit investors, there's that offering memorandum exemption I told you about, which literally is a prescribed form of offering document, a risk acknowledgement form. You can sell it to the public. So you do, for example, a Reg A plus deal, you do an OM wrapper together, you can sell, you can light it up on your platforms and sell to the public, other than Ontario. So when I'm looking at the portals, they're the new dealers in town. So you can be a lawyer and be chasing the investment banker from whatever you do business with, of which there's only a few of them. There's a lot of portals, and they're the new relationship. There's lots of work to be done at all aspects of this. So in terms of the cross-border aspects, I'll remind you that there are opportunities, and I'll leave you with this. If you are a portal and you're going northbound, we do have securities laws up there. And I find whether it's in the US or Europe or otherwise, many times portals coming in don't even recognize that they have to be registered to sell securities in our jurisdiction. Or even thinking that, well, if we comply with the accredited investor rules in the US, we're good to go. Well, I think if it was vice versa, an Canadian company raising capital here, they have to comply with US securities laws. So I find that many times selling to Canadians, they just forget about it. And they can't, because, I mean, someone mentioned Eureka. That was a small little thing, but I mean, the point was clearly made that you can't do this. There's not a similar case yet in Canada, any jurisdiction, but you do have to comply with the exemptions, the credit investor exemption, file report of trades, et cetera. And if you have any offering document, there has to be rights of action that, you can be sued, et cetera. So it just want to remember that if you do raise capital cross-border, there's securities laws on both sides of the border. Thank you very much.
One question. John? Yes, even the Canadian securities laws, are there national securities laws, or is it like mostly by the provinces, by the different different provinces?
Yeah, good question. Each province has a Securities Act that's probably about this thick, and it has rules and regulations that are this thick. So technically what's happened is they've all joined together an umbrella organization called the Canadian Securities Administrators. They all meet, consider like NASA, about 50 of them, and they try to hammer out what I call nationalized and harmonized rules and regulations. So as a securities lawyer, you always have to ask yourself, okay, I'm good to go in a credit investor. It's the same across Canada pretty well, other than all of a sudden BC has a special report of trade you have to do and everyone else has a separate one. That's what ends up happening. So you have to be sensitive of they're not always the same, but they try to work together to be consistent. But if you just looked at what I discussed in crowdfunding, you can see how each jurisdiction is taking a different view. Like Manitoba is not even in the certain conversations. BC's totally out of the crowdfunding one, while Ontario and Quebec are leading the charge on that one. So it's kind of like a patchwork, but I don't want you to think you got to comply and they're completely different. There's a way that it's done, and they have I'm listening to the state coordinated review on terms of Reg A. I think it's tier 1. I equate that to in our world that if you did a passport application, like you are in a province, you have a principal regulator, and they're basically driving your exemptive relief or whatever you're doing, the other provinces can chime in or not.
But here the SEC is the primary regulator, then you have states as another layer. Is like in your state, regardless of whether they're harmonized, is pretty much your province pretty much the only securities regulator in Canada?
Good question. The answer is yes. Constitutionally, securities law is the jurisdiction of the provinces. However, they're trying to get a national securities commission in Canada, and they now have an office set up to accomplish that, not for the, like certain provinces are joined together, like BC and Ontario, and I think recently one of the territories just announced that they're part of it, but they're not there yet, and there's very controversial of whether people like that or not. They like having their own local, especially out west. They had in Alberta, they're not necessarily for it at all.
Yeah, I would argue your systems were federalists are improved federalism. I think that's good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have there been any post-Jobs Act enforcement actions in Canada for 5 or 6 cells?
I think that, yeah, like I speak with different regulators for different things I do in, whether it's BC, Alberta, Ontario. I'm not aware of any enforcement action. I think what's happening is conversations are happening. So they're aware, like it's typical, a call will go in, it's, how come they can do that, right? And I think the conversations at this point that I'm aware of are not enforcement related, but they'll get the call and they'll write them a letter that has one sentence. Please explain how your portal complies with Ontario securities law. And then go from there. Yeah, no, then there's a lot. You got to call your lawyer, and there's tons of work, and you don't want that letter. But it is happening, and I think the approach generally is not to, stamp it out immediately, but to try to work slowly with people that are offside. Thank you very much.